Hey everyone, good evening and welcome to our study on the book of James. We have been going through this book. This is our ninth session and we're actually going to close it out today. It's a book that you really probably could spend a whole lot more time on, but we are going to let James have the final word tonight. And I'm very excited to be joined by Darlene and Justin. It's a blessing to have their voices be part of this conversation. And I hope that you can glean something tonight that helps you on your journey with Jesus and becoming more like Christ, something that I struggle with all the time. I need as well. And James is packing punches. It is really a little bit of a shotgun approach of Christian living. Here's a whole bunch of ideas. Maybe this one will really hit you right now, and if you read it again, something else will really hit you. But that's exactly how the book ends, with some powerful words about some different things. And so I'm going to begin by reading in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You've hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You've lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. So there's another palatable one that we can just take down from the book of James as we're finishing this up.
Well, I mean, there's always this challenge that I think we're facing as wealthy people in a tradition that condemns wealth. I mean, that's it. I mean, that's really pretty clear, and chapter 5 really sort of draws us home, really kind of draws this thing home, and we've talked about it before in James. He's mentioned it before in James. I think, Brian, you probably know this, and I probably mentioned it. I think Jesus talks more about wealth in the Gospels than any other subject. I mean, he's really only talking about the kingdom of God. He only talks about one subject, but anyway.
Yeah.
But within that conversation, it's wealth, and it's never positive, at least rarely positive. So for us to be living in a very wealthy context, even if we don't feel particularly wealthy, what does it look like for us then to be working through our wealth in the midst of this larger conversation I think that James is drawing us into, and the fact that he has sort of been taking us on this conversation through here, and then in this last chapter he comes back to wealth and patience and prayer. I think are more positive ways to end, but before we get to patience and prayer, we have to come through wealth one more time, and the way that he's drawing this community, I think, into justice. And I think justice is really one of the main themes I see in James, is what does it look like for us to do justice with one another? And James, I think, has really been hitting this hard in various ways. He's not always using that word. He does, but he doesn't always use it. And so once again, we're kind of being drawn back into this, what does justice look like for those of us who believe in God, and how do we do justice with one another?
Mm-hmm. And when I read that section, just listen to you read it, Brian, about wealth, and then thinking about other scriptures that speak to wealth. And I'm wondering if it's, the lack of humility, the arrogance that may sometimes go hand in hand. Because is it wealth in and of itself that's the negative and that's the bad? Or is it the arrogance and the lack of humility that one now has because they perceive they have this particular wealth? And so what I drew away from this is that you don't want to covet, wealth and money to the exclusion. Don't covet it, full stop, period. Mm-hmm. And then remain humble, because here it speaks about you're not paying your workers here. And so that's certainly not godlike. So you're causing people to work for you who's probably anticipated being paid, and now you've chosen not to pay them. So I'm looking, that's an attitude and arrogance and selfishness and things like that. So when you equate that with wealth, then it seems as if it's a negative. But what if you had chosen to do something positive with what you had been given and blessed with? Feeding the poor, helping the widows and the children and things of that nature. Then your wealth can be a positive. It just seems as if when we speak about wealth, it's easier for a camel to get to an eye of a needle than the rich man to get to heaven. So when you think about it, but it's the mindset. That's what I think is being condemned.
Yeah.
Well, it is interesting. I mean, from what we think we know, in the first century, there's the economic principle that people are operating under is something we call limited good. The idea being there's only a certain amount of stuff in the world. And so if there's only a certain amount of stuff, then the argument here is wealthy people have more than they need and poor people have less than they need. And the way that we work through that is redistribution or sharing or so forth. So it's this interesting notion that you get here, which is he's condemning the wealthy in this community or these communities. And how are they wealthy? And in verse 4, you've withheld wages. You've been doing unjust things to gain wealth. You are hoarding. You are having more than you need. You could be doing better with what you have. You could be doing justice with what you have, and instead you're doing injustice. And so what does it look like to use our resources to do justice in our own community? And what does it look like to use our resources to do injustice, or by hoarding those resources to do injustice? And so this is a constant critique of the prophets against Israel. As you get into that phase of life with Israel, as the destruction by the Assyrians and destruction by the Babylonians is near, one of the main critiques is you're not taking care of the poor and the widow and the orphan and the alien and the most vulnerable among you. You are exploiting them. You are, using that to your own gain. You are doing injustice with one another and crying out to God for justice. And so the prophets go this, you can't do that. It doesn't make sense to do injustice and then cry to God for justice. And I think, once again, we're kind of being drawn back into this with James. What does it look like to do justice? This is what discipleship looks like. It's not divorced from justice. It's part of that. And wealth management, for lack of better words, is part of that. And so what does it look like?
Or just I like when you said hoarding the resources. If you're hoarding too much,
Yeah.
you have much more than you need.
Right.
So, because I believe that just in a practical standpoint, what that means to me today, I've even in my household, having recently cleared out my parents' home, and I had heard a prayer recently. Someone at Pepperdine was speaking, and he says, if I ask God for more, so I can give it to others, right? So, and I'm in my household, I'm clearing out everything. And so my husband and son are saying, wait, Mom, we might need that. And I'm like, I already have two. I don't want more. I don't want extra. And so I don't want to hoard because, it has its own, it can be overwhelming when you have too much stuff. And so it's better to pass it on to somebody who can use it. So
there's this visual that I sometimes use that I saw a long time ago, and it says, if you open your hands and then clench your fists, into which can you fit more? Well, it's the open hand, right? But in the open hand, more falls out, but more goes in. It's in the clenched fist that we can only hold a limited amount. It won't slip out as much, right? But you can't fit any more in there. So when you open those hands, yes, more goes out, but more comes in. So even this idea of, are we using what we have with open hands, or are we using it with clenched fists to say, I'm going to keep whatever I have as tightly as I possibly can?
If that, and Brian, I'm going to let you jump into, but
You guys are crushing. I'm just going to dig it off. It's the ninth one. I'm kind of ready for you guys to just go.
But it feeds into also that what you just used, the open hand. More comes in, some goes out, and that's what my mother would always tell me, you can't outgive God.
Right.
So the more you give away, a lot comes back to you in very different ways. And so a clenched fist, nothing much is going to come to you, and you're not going to let go of anything, but not much is going to come into that clenched fist. So, but if you open it up, the more you give away, the more it will find its way back to you. And then, frankly, you'll have more to give away.
So the cycle just kind of repeats, right?
Yeah, and I just think it's hard to have trust in God when in reality our credit cards are what we believe in, as far as or debit card. Maybe you don't believe in credit cards, but just as far as, all right, you need lunch, you guys swipe this, I need gas, swipe this, I need this. And it's just like it becomes where we then put our trust. Like our trust moves, our hearts move to this thing, that's this piece of plastic in your pocket. But obviously it's tied to like the realities of what's in your account. But that is really where our trust is. And I just think it's something that we, as a church leader, can be like, oh, it's a little awkward to talk about giving, but it definitely is something that is taught about very often, and something that I just think is so necessary. And then the best people that I know are the most generous people. It's the people who don't, as Justin was saying, clench their fists or hoard. It's those who just have that perspective, and their heart is just so much less anxious. Like, do you trust in God? Then okay, give. And it doesn't have to be our church, so you don't think I'm being selfish and saying this, but do you trust in God? Okay, then give to something that matters to you. Give and be generous. And unfortunately, I just think our trajectory isn't necessarily great on this. My wife does work with nonprofit companies, and one specifically, a very, very large nonprofit company, they decided to just do a study on giving. And I won't mention which one, but it's one that you would know if I said it, but it doesn't really matter which one. But they just did a study on the giving amongst their givers and then like more broadly. And they found that generations, basically people like 60 and above, were consistent, like committed givers. Like they just would consistently give, and they were often some of the larger givers, and they were really deeply committed to the cause. And then what ended up happening, like as the generations were studied further down, as it got younger, like they said there was no one like them coming up, like that generation, as far as like being committed to giving to like a certain organization. And I understand suspicions with institutions. I understand suspicions because people have been wronged by them. But I would just ask you, and it's something that I ask myself, like, well, what are you giving to? If you don't believe in a certain thing, then how are you giving it? So how are you giving some of what you have? Because if you're watching this, it is likely that you're in the top 5% of the world's wealth. And I know it doesn't feel that way because we have Bill Gates and all these people who are extravagantly wealthy, and we compare ourselves to them. But compare yourself to the rest of the world, my friend. It really, you don't have to look that hard. And then the condemning part, most condemning part for me on this is the workers. You fail to pay your workers wages. How'd you get your food? And probably it was someone picking it who is working for a wage that you wouldn't work for personally, to do impossibly hard labor. And I just think these types of things we have to live in tension with, and we can't just go, oh, whatever, I'm just gonna not think about this. Like, it's likely that you are in the top 5% of the world's wealth, if not toward the top of that, to be honest. And how then are you giving? How are you saying with your wealth, I trust in the kingdom of God, and I am choosing to like generously see myself as a conduit? Because I think we start to have this I deserve it mindset. And the fact is, perhaps you've worked really hard in your career and you've done really well, but who is it that gave you that brain? Who is it that you were blessed enough to perhaps to pursue a higher education? You're blessed enough perhaps to pursue a master's degree. Or if you're really dumb, you pursue a PhD.
Yes.
But all of these things that you can start to believe it's mine. Like, oh, I've worked hard for this. And yes, you have worked hard, but who put you in that position? You are blessed to be born in the United States, for despite its flaws, is a place where you have the opportunity to build a large amount of wealth. And can you have a perspective that lives generously and says, again, this isn't about giving to our church, though, if you're watching this, I hope you believe in what we're doing and you do feel called to do that. But where are you giving to? What is it that you're doing that helps you to just be a conduit and not holding it down? And these are just really stinging words. He starts in chapter 1 talking about rich people and then just hammers it. So I just hope it's something that you really live in tension with, because you can't easily dismiss it. And it probably is the most important word for those of us in the U.S. today. How are you using your wealth to bless others? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, you should do some soul searching and think about a good answer, because I think it's something that we need to be convicted of.
I was going to say, one of the things I do try to talk to students about a little bit is the idea of cultivating a spirit of generosity when you don't have much.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I'm teaching students at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, a lot of my students are working, federal student aid jobs, or they're working other jobs, or they're going to school. They're being pushed and pulled in lots of different directions. And I remember being an undergraduate student and not really having much money. You might get to the end of the week and have enough to go to Jack in the Box or something, on a Friday night or something. Not much else. You lived in the dining halls, and, eating there and all those things. So a lot of times students will say, well, Dr. Smith, I don't have a lot. Cultivating a spirit of generosity when you don't have much will typically carry over when you have more. As we give of our time, as we give of our resources, as we give of all of these different things that we have, it's not always about writing a check and giving in that way. What does it look like to be a generous person? And I tend to think money just makes you more of who you already are. If you're a generous person, money allows you to be even more generous, like sometimes extravagantly generous. If you're not a particularly generous person, money makes it so that you can just spend all of that stuff on yourself. It typically, I think, brings out who you are. Does money change some people? Sure, absolutely. I think that's right. But I think for a lot of folks, as you start to make more money, it allows you to be the kind of person you already are. And if you've cultivated generosity from an early stage, that's part of what you feel, you understand that you're called to be. It tends to translate over as you move into spaces where you can potentially be more generous with what you have.
And I think it was an important point also that you commented upon with respect to your students who may not have a lot monetarily right now, but there are so many aspects and so many ways to give.
Mm-hmm.
And because sometimes a problem is not always solved with a check, although oftentimes it can be very helpful, but sometimes you need human capital, people to show up if there's a project to work on. So there are so many ways, I think, in that respect, especially when you don't have monetary wealth, to give of yourself, to give of your time, to make a meal, to help with Excensia, as we do here, the church, our family promise, and different little buy some bread, or there's a lot of things that can be done that don't require a large expenditure of money, and that's just as important.
Definitely, yeah, and I think that it unlocks the heart of it. So we'll continue going. So we're planning to get through the end of 5 today. Starting in verse 7, be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you'll be condemned. More strong words from James, but mainly that section is about being able to endure in suffering, and I think that is obviously an important theme. It's especially convicting because he's writing this to people who were had their lives at stake, and who were constantly putting themselves at risk by claiming to be Christians and converting to Christianity. And so he's saying, be patient, let that pain wash through you a little bit. Don't resist it. And then it's always hard when someone uses Job as an encouraging example. Let's go to Job for some encouragement, and that's a little rough. But I think that there is something very biblical about this idea and this concept of what it is to live into the faithfulness of God.
Yeah, I think patience is just even conceptually, it's just something that we sort of struggle with. We've spent time in the last few sessions talking about the technology and the immediacy of everything, and I think we've become more and more impatient as everything is at our fingertips. As why is this taking so long? Why, how come you're not responding to my email as quickly as? I mean, I just sent it. Why aren't you, responding? It's been 5 minutes. Why is my connection so slow? Why is it taking so long for this to start? Why, everything is just now, right? And it's coming through in our behaviors now, the way that we can't be inconvenienced, and we can't, if it takes longer than 5 minutes, and even 5 minutes is long for a lot of us.
Yeah.
This idea, I think, of patience is just one that we really are struggling with, and I think even in the midst of patience, just even this idea of perseverance. It's not just waiting for something to happen, but it's enduring. And what does it look like for us to be cultivating the endurance of saying, these things that we're a part of are unfolding slowly, like 2,000 years slowly. And just because it's unfolding slowly doesn't mean it's not unfolding, doesn't mean it's not happening. That we are moving toward the completion of all of these things. And what does it look like for us to remain faithful? What does it look like for us to cultivate the endurance of that? And maybe it's different for us. Maybe because we don't feel like we're being particularly persecuted, or life is particularly difficult, or we wake up and we have all of these modern conveniences and we don't really seem to want for very much. That for us, patience and endurance works conceptually but not experientially.
Mm-hmm.
But so much of Christian experience through the centuries has been one of endurance and patience. What does it look like for us to sort of reclaim that as part of our current experience?
I like the point that you made about just technology and how it's impacted our issues with patience. I think it's really, we want things done yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I think we always lived in an instant gratification world,
Mm-hmm.
and technology has moved up the pace of things a lot. And so, I mean, when we were talking before about just disconnecting from these devices that are controlling our lives, and when you do disconnect, I've been labeled a poor communicator because I don't want to be held hostage by these devices. Do I have to respond immediately? Can I take a moment to think about it? Can I get back with you in 24 hours even? So it's just like, it's almost as if you're penalized for not, responding. It's instant gratification, and clients want immediate response, and other people want immediate response. So when I think about patience now, it's harder to do.
Yeah.
I think it is harder to do. But, and then when you mentioned about endurance, endurance, when you're suffering, of course we want it to be solved right away. We want that pain to go right away, but even suffering can be a process of this endurance, and you'll learn something when you get to the other side. I'm hoping through some challenges that I've faced, and as much as I've had to endure and still enduring, that this will end and I'll learn something on the other side, but it's painful.
Yeah. My dad and I have had conversations about that over the years where, I've said to him, I'm learning some things by going through some really painful stuff. And I've said to him, I'd like to think I could have learned this without going through it. And ideally, like intuitively, I could learn these lessons without having to go through really painful experiences. And yet it just doesn't seem to work quite that way. Generally, it's we go through the difficulties. Job is a wonderful example of someone who goes through some really, really terrible things. And in that process doesn't waver in his faith, but has some really frank conversations with God in a way that I think is really amazing and powerful, and also very bold, I think, on Job's part, as he's calling God to account. God finally responds and says, slow down. Let me call you to account. And they come to this understanding where Job goes, I understand my place in this conversation. And I think that's hard for a lot of us, is sort of, what does it look like for us to understand our place in this conversation with God, let alone what does it look like to understand our place in this conversation with one another?
Yeah, our daughter is 3, just about to turn 4, and she's gotten to a stage where she definitely doesn't want to do things unless she wants to do them. As far as like, if we're, it used to be she was like quiet enough you could take her to the store, take her to do whatever. And so now, as she started recognizing, like, hey, we're not going home. Where are we headed, basically? And then it's like, oh, we're gonna go to the store for a minute. I don't want to go to the store. Take me home. And it's, I think that we're all like that a little bit. We want things quick. We want to like not have to do some of the hard work. But some of the times in my life that I would say were the most difficult have cleansed me of a lot of my pride and arrogance and a lot of the things that I know. So I'm thankful for them. I wouldn't wish to go through them again, but there have been blessings that come from those seasons and from those things. And when you think about loss and what, again, these early Christians are dealing with and the difficulties that they are facing daily, I've heard it said, and I think it's true, that all of us are living the book of Job. It's just most of us get to do it more slowly. And
Good point.
we're all giving it all away eventually. And hopefully you will have better friends than Job does as you try to think it out theologically. But we're all living it, and we're all in this process of learning to let go and give things away and realize that you aren't in control of the most important things in your life. Things you love the most, you have very little control over. And if you're trying to control people around you, they're not going to experience love. They're going to experience control and not love. And so it's sometimes these lessons that, exactly as you said, Justin, you wish perhaps that you could have learned in another way, that unfortunately you can't always. And it's a challenge. And so maybe from the very, very beginning of James, consider it pure joy when you face a trial. And you're like, wait, hold on, what? Pure joy? But I think of the line about Jesus, it was for the joy set before him that he went to the cross. And we aren't very good at perseverance and patience. We say patience is a virtue, but we don't actually believe that, I don't think, like in the way we practice life. And I think to set that as an end goal of like, all right, I am developing perseverance in this season. I'm developing patience, and I'm thankful for that. And like say that is going to make a difference. I want to read this final section just to end as we end our time together. But I'd like to just ask for one thing from the book of James as you've been able to dive in a bit. What is one thing that you'll take away? Justin, what's one thing for you?
I don't know if it's a word that we've talked about a lot, but I would say dedication. I think sort of bubbling just underneath the surface of James is this concept of dedication. What does it look like to be dedicated to Christ? What does it look like to be dedicated to discipleship? What does it look like to be dedicated to one another? What does it look like to be dedicated to the process? And that dedication, I think, comes out in the way that we view the world and the way that we view our interactions with the world. So I think sometimes I don't know if we lose the concept of dedication in the midst of our understanding of discipleship. Mm-hmm. I think we like the idea of following Jesus on some level, but I don't know if we really grasp the dedication it takes to make that a lifelong thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think just kind of bubbling underneath the surface of James is that call to being deeply dedicated to discipleship.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Ryan?
I think about just overall the theme that I pulled away. So my takeaway, intentionality, mm-hmm. And also I was going to say, I pulled out a lot on just submission in the most holiest, positive sense of the word. Asking God for help when you need it. And that even in your struggles, that there's something greater that's going to come from that, right? No one can tell you. Sorry, that's what I wish someone could have told me, but the lessons that I've learned through the deepest struggles, they kind of are life changing in many instances, and so that for me is what I've taken away. And then be intentional about your service and your worship, and prayer. Just being prayerful and humble.
Yeah, I think those are great. I think that the idea of God being able to draw near to us, I think, is something that I'll remember, that there's the little decisions matter. The words you use matters, and you have the ability to draw near to God. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to give a special word of thanks to Darlene and to Charlie and to John who joined us. It was just wonderful to have you all as part of the conversations for these sessions, and it helped us, I think, put it more practically on the ground, which was really helpful. Thank you, as always, to Dr. Justin Smith for being part of these conversations, and to Philip Pasanchin for being our behind-the-scenes guy. Without him, this doesn't happen, because he makes it look cool back here and as hip as we possibly can. So we're super thankful for him preparing that. We hope these have been a blessing to you. As I said, I just want to end by reading the final words of James, and I hope for all of us that these words continue to be a challenge. Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray. Is anyone happy? Let them sing songs of praise. Is anyone among you sick? Let them call the elders of the church to pray over them and anoint them with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven. Therefore, confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. My brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth, and someone should bring that person back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. Let's allow James to have the final word on this study of James. I hope that this has given you things to think about as it has me. If you have any questions or you need anything, you can email me, Brian with a Y at Glendale.church. I'd love for you to learn more about following Jesus and also to be part of our church family. We have a prayer call that starts in just a few minutes, and you're welcome to join us for that as well. You can contact me for more information. Thank you for joining us. Have a great evening.